welcome everybody to the 7th Nature Chain talk. Yes, sorry, Stephen, our original host has come down with COVID, so it's been a bit difficult last minute sorting out. So anyway, this evening we're very lucky to be joined by wildlife photographer Stephen Davis, who's going to talk to us about the beauty and diversity of butterflies in Wiltshire, illustrating them with his own photographs. As a career ecologist, Stephen spent 27 years working for both English Nature and Natural England in Kent and Wiltshire, and also most recently as head of conservation for Wiltshire Wildlife Trust. That was until 2019. But he now dedicates his time to photography, using it to support and promote a wider understanding of the importance of the environment and nature conservation. I think that's about it for now. So over to you, please.
Well, thank you. I couldn't have said that better myself. I probably wrote that. But thank you very much. I'm delighted to be speaking to you tonight. It's a pity we can't sort of share a venue together, but hopefully this will go smoothly. I've been passionate about butterflies since I was tiny, from the age of 2, which is rather a long time now. I worked in Kent, but I've been in Wiltshire for 23 years now. And one of the reasons I came to Wiltshire, working as an ecologist, was because I knew how good it was for butterflies. In the UK, there are 59 species of butterfly. It's 57 resident breeding species and 2 regular migrants. And in Wiltshire, there are 47 species resident and breeding. And that excludes some habitat specialists like the swallowtail, which occurs in Norfolk, and the mountain ringlet, which occurs in Scotland, which obviously we don't get down here. So I'm looking forward to speaking to you. And it's a very appropriate time of year. I saw my first brimstone in the garden today. The weather's warmed up a bit. The brimstone is top right. It's this wonderful yellow butterfly, which I'm sure most people will be familiar with. Top left is a comma, and the peacock bottom right, and the bottom left is the orange tip. The first 3 I mentioned, they all overwinter as an adult, which is quite remarkable if you think about it. They find a nook and a cranny somewhere, a shed, or the sort of ivy on a tree. For example, the brimstone is famed for having a deep venation on its wings, which look rather like the underside of an ivy leaf. And as an adult, the brimstone is the butterfly which survives the longest as an adult. So if you see a brimstone flying in August, it will feed up on nectar and hibernate the whole of the winter, emerge in the first warm days of spring, mate, and possibly fly through to May. So it's a remarkable sort of 9 to 10 months as an adult for such a fragile insect. The comma also overwinters as an adult, as does the peacock. The orange tip is one of the first of the butterflies which emerges from a life stage which overwinters not as an adult. So it overwinters as a chrysalis. I get a real thrill, particularly when I see a brimstone in the spring, and also the orange tip. I really know that the spring has started, and I hesitate to say, but it does feel as if all is good in the world in a normal year anyway. Now, the distribution of butterflies and the occurrence and presence of them in Wiltshire is very much dictated by our geology. We have a remarkable amount of chalk downland. This is Pewsey Downs National Nature Reserve, which has these lovely sort of deeply incised combes, slopes grazed by cattle, This is the Pewsey Vale. There's two little outliers here. This is Woodbury Hill, the Pewsey Vale, and then Salisbury Plain in the distance. Now, Salisbury Plain training area is probably the most important site for butterflies in Wiltshire, although bits of it are obviously closed off for access. But it's a remarkable area, the size of the Isle of Wight, of unimproved chalk grassland, which has not been subject to either development or herbicides or pesticides. And I'll mention it again later, but one butterfly in particular, the marsh fritillary, occurs on Salisbury Plain, and it's probably the most important colony in the whole of the United Kingdom and possibly Europe, occurring there. So we've got this remarkable geology. We've got the chalk on the downlands, and then we've also got the clay vales, where we are particularly well blessed in areas like the Braden Forests, Savernake Forest, Cranbourne Chase, where we've got some fantastic ancient woodlands which occur on the sort of clay with flint soils which overlay the chalk. We've got the big broader landscape, but also within habitats we've got a sort of micro landscape. The topography lends itself to having a variety of different aspects on the site. You get north facing, south facing, east facing, west facing slopes, and they all create sort of different gradations in temperature. But also within a site, depending on the level of grazing, you get very great variations in temperature. And on a site like this, which is Little Langford Down, which is on the edge of the Wylye Valley on the northern side of Cranbourne, Groveley Wood, you get these ant hills, which are just absolutely amazing, covered in thyme and rock crows. And there's a species of ant called the yellow meadow ant, which creates these wonderful hummocks. And this is absolutely indicative of land which has never been ploughed and never been subject to any agricultural improvement. This is the same site. You can see the abundance and distribution of the anthills, and this is looking actually northwards towards an area of downland called Perham Down. But most of our chalk downs have this sort of characteristic anthills. Some sites, they're more abundant than others. We also have a chalk landscape which has been very much modified by man. These are agricultural strip lynchets, which are sort of man modified in the Neolithic times. These terracets were created for the sort of planting of crops. And these lines here, these little sort of terraces you can see, are the result of centuries of grazing livestock, basically walking around the slopes, and you get a bit of soil creep wherever they're treading. And these are sort of both cattle and sheep grazed. This is at Mere in the south of the county. Cattle grazing is by far the best habitat management for the promotion of butterflies within that habitat. They are much less selective eaters when they're grazing compared to sheep. Sheep just graze off all the flowers. It's best to put sheep on in the winter when the flowers aren't flowering and the butterflies aren't sort of egg laying, and any larvae that are on the site are sort of well down in the sward. But cattle grazing is very important, particularly sort of mid to late summer, because you need the sward grazed down. You need the growth of the grass and any sort of thatch trampled down and the grass grazed off. This is at Morgan's Hill. And this is the wonderful chalk downland sward with scabious, small scabious, wild carrot, hawkbit, red clover, absolutely wonderful kaleidoscope of colours on our chalk downs. This is at Coombe Bissett in the south of the county. It's hard to see, but can you see my pointer? Is it moving on the screen?
Yeah, it's very lightly moving. Stephen, can I just, while we're talking, can I just ask people to mute, please? I've got 3 people who haven't muted, and I can't do it from this end because I'm not the host at the moment.
That's fine. This is an area owned by the Wiltshire Wildlife Trust at Coombe Bissett. One of the interesting things that they've done on this site is that over the years they've been progressively buying up areas of arable land adjacent to it. Most recently, this area in the distance, and reverting it to chalk downland. And this sward here, which I'm sure Paul will be interested in, was planted, sown with a chalk downland mix. It had been arable since the war, and it's now a wonderful kaleidoscope of scabious and wild carrot. And that's taken about 15 to 20 years to establish as a really, really good downland sward. This is a wonderful little plant called dropwort. It's a relative of the meadowsweet in a sward at a site called Dunscombe Bottom on the edge of Salisbury Plain. Some of our downlands are absolutely astonishing for orchids. This is the fragrant orchid, particularly abundant on the Pewsey Downs. And you can possibly see in the bottom there are some fluffy seed heads here of the plant kidney vetch, which is the food plant of the small blue butterfly, which I'll be showing later. So on to butterflies. I've grouped them by sort of family group. So the whites, the browns, the blues, the fritillaries, just to make it sort of slightly easier. There are also, you can group them into habitat specialists. So any butterfly, or a lot of butterflies occurring on chalk downland, like the Adonis blue, chalkhill blue, are absolutely confined to that chalk downland habitat. Their food plant, the horseshoe vetch, only occurs in that habitat. Whereas in the wider countryside, you've got species like the orange tip, brimstone, peacock, tortoiseshell. They are called generalists, and they occupy a much broader range of habitats, particularly including sort of damp meadows, field margins, woodland rides, hedge boundaries. The wonderful orange tip, so called because the male has this wonderful orange flash on the forewing here, and the female, it's absent. It breeds on 2 different plants. Excuse me, I'll have a drink. The first is cuckoo flower, which is a wonderful little plant of sort of damp meadows. And this plant here is hedge garlic or garlic mustard. The female lays her eggs just below the flower here, and the larvae feed on these developing seed pods. It really is a wonderfully delicate butterfly. You see the female doesn't have any orange on the forewing. It's also incredibly cryptically camouflaged when it's got its wings closed at rest. This is at rest on the sort of flower head of cow parsley, particularly flying at that time of year. And if you look hard enough in the hedgerows, you can find butterflies at rest, hiding. On the right hand side is the male on a flower head of red campion. Now, a lot of people think the whites are just cabbage whites. However, any white you see flying could be a female orange tip, it could be a green-veined white, it could be a small white, or it could be a large white. And they're actually all rather beautiful. On the left-hand side here is the green-veined white. It has these black scales along the margins of the wing veins, and on the right hand side is the small white. They both breed on sort of small native plant species in the Brassica family. This is the female brimstone again, at rest on a cowslip. The female is a wonderful sort of pale, doesn't make sense, lilac-y green I was going to say, but it's this wonderful green colour compared to the vibrant yellow of the males. And this breeds on two species of buckthorn, the purging buckthorn, which occurs on chalk downland, chalky soils, and then the alder buckthorn, which occurs on sort of damper, more acidic soils. So largely in Wiltshire, I think when you see this, it's occurring or breeding on purging buckthorn. It's a very regular visitor to gardens. This is at the height of the summer on at rest on a bit of lavender, and this is on a everlasting pea. There is another yellow butterfly, which is less commonly seen, but it is a regular migrant to the UK and Wiltshire. This is the clouded yellow, which migrates every year from Europe, not necessarily in particularly high numbers, although occasionally you do get so-called clouded yellow years, but they tend to sort of appear first in sort of May and June, and then the females will lay eggs on clovers, and then the eggs hatch, the larvae feed up, and you will see a brood later in the summer. So you're probably more likely to see these in late August to September. They feed on legumes, including lucerne, and occasionally, and I've seen it once in a field in Kent, a blue field of lucerne, just dancing with thousands and thousands of bright yellow, clouded yellows. Quite wonderful. So that was all of those, that previous group are in the family Pieridae, which is the whites really. And then the next group I'm going to talk about is they're in a family called the Lycaenidae, and that's the blues, the hair streaks, and the coppers. This is a common blue. Just note this white margin here is completely pure and white, which is different to the Adonis blue when this fringe is pierced by a black vein. And it's also more generalist in the sort of habitats that it occupies. It'll occur on downland, it'll occur in hay meadows, and it feeds on, or breeds on, the female lays her eggs on bird's foot trefoil. Now all of the blues can be rather confusing, particularly when they've got the wings closed, because they all characteristically have a number of spots and circles and orange spots here on the underside, although there are a couple of exceptions which I'll mention when I come across them. So this looks superficially very similar to the previous, but this is the Adonis blue. On the left-hand side is the female, which has a brown background colour on the hind wing, and also the forewing is brown. And the Adonis blue has the sort of grey background colour, but it is also the most iridescent, or wonderfully iridescent and bright of all our blues. And you'll see the black vein here pierces through the white margin on the wing. The Adonis blue occurs in two broods. It flies usually last week in May and through June, and then has another brood late summer, late August into September. And it really, if you see these, particularly if it's flying amongst other blues, you'll you'll know, because it just sparkles like a fragment of sky which somebody has just grabbed and brought down to earth. The Adonis blue breeds in short grazed turf on horseshoe vetch, often in association with bare ground. These are the warmest south-facing slopes of our downs, and they really are just the most wonderful butterfly to see. The chalk soils are characteristically incredibly shallow and very, very free draining. This is only a couple of centimetres really of organic matter which has built up over the years. And then there's a very sort of thin layer of soil which is a little bit more broken up. You're very, very quickly down into the sort of, you know, the chalk, the Cretaceous chalk bedrock. So very, very free draining, very, very warm, and it's exactly what particularly the Adonis blue and the chalk hill blue like. And the temperature is really all about the choice of site that the female chooses for egg laying. They really need a very warm location for the eggs and the larvae to develop quickly. This is the chalk hill blue. It's got this wonderfully sort of iridescent but milky blue colour compared to the Adonis blue, and also the blue doesn't extend, excuse me, blue doesn't extend to the right to the edge of the wing. You've got a sort of slightly brown margin here, but again the underside is very similar to the other blues, although the orange markings are a little bit less than in some of the other blues. And then the next blue in the blue family isn't actually blue, it's brown. This is the brown Argus. On the left is the male, and on the right hand side is the female. And the only really distinguishing feature is that in the female, these orange spots extend all the way to the front edge of the forewing, whereas in the male, they get fainter and fainter, and in some cases they peter out. And this butterfly breeds on common rock rose, which is a very common plant of chalk downland. Confusingly, all of these blues fly together on the best of sites, particularly in late summer when numbers have sort of built up and the second broods are strong. There are a couple of other blues. On the left-hand side is the silver studded blue. You'll note in this spot here, there are some silvery blue scales within this black circle. And the silver studded blue doesn't occur on the chalk. It actually occurs on heathland, and in Wiltshire really only occurs on the fringes of the New Forest and places like Landford Bog in the south of the county, breeding on a variety of species of heather. The picture on the right hand side is actually the large blue, which doesn't occur in Wiltshire. I just put it in there as a comparison, and to let you know, it has been very successfully reintroduced to the limestone grasslands in Gloucestershire and Somerset. So if you were wanting to go and see the large blue, which is a fantastic species, you would just need to pop over the border into Gloucestershire or Somerset. And this is the butterfly, which has this extraordinary life cycle whereby the larvae are taken down into an ant's nest of an ant called Myrmica sabuleti, and the caterpillars of the butterfly feed on the ant grubs, and then they pupate in the ant nest, and then in warm days in June the butterfly emerges from the chrysalis underground and then crawls out and dries its wings and flies away, carries on its life cycle. I mentioned there are a couple of blues which don't have the orange spots. This is the small blue. It is tiny. This possibly doesn't really illustrate how tiny it is, but it really is about half the size of all the other blues. No real blue coloration, although fresh specimens they do have a sort of deep tinge of navy perhaps to them. On the underside there just are a series of lines of black dots encircled by white. A butterfly I haven't got a picture of is the holly blue, which is a very common garden species. If you see a blue butterfly in your garden, and particularly if you've got holly and ivy in the garden in the spring and later in the summer with the second brood, it'll be the holly blue, which lays her eggs on holly in the spring and then ivy later on in the second brood in the summer. There is another delightful butterfly in the same family, the Lycaenidae. This is the small copper, which breeds on common sorrel. They are often found just basking on sort of open patches of ground or resting, roosting, and they tend to do it sort of facing down, interestingly, and also with their wings up at an angle rather than flat out. But they really are delightful little species. These are a couple of species in the hairstreak family. They're still in the Lycaenidae. On the left-hand side is the white letter hairstreak, characterized by this W, and it breeds on elm. It suffered catastrophically as a result of Dutch elm disease in the 1960s and has just about survived in small pockets within woodlands and hedgerows where wych elm has persisted. You can see this species, for example, in small areas within Savernake, places like Raven's Roost Wood in the Braden Forest and one or two areas. And then this is on the right-hand side, the underside of the purple hairstreak, which breeds on oak, which is much, much more common. It's a very common and widespread species, although in common with most hairstreaks, rather difficult to see because they spend most of their life cycle as an adult up in the canopy of the tree, where they feed.
Permanent ceasefire in the culture wars that broke out over colonial.
Television on. The purple hairstreak feeds on honeydew on the top of sort of oak leaves and the top of the canopy of the tree. And the white-legged hairstreak will come down to take nectar from bramble, for example, but that also will take honeydew from aphids, the secretion which the aphids leave on the leaf rather than actually taking it directly from the aphid. And that's how they get their sugars. This is a wonderful butterfly called the brown hairstreak. It's also actually reasonably widespread on the clay soils in particular, but does occur on Salisbury Plain on some of the chalk. It occurs in blackthorn hedges and small sort of copses and woodland edges which have a lot of blackthorn. It's a very secretive and sort of widely distributed butterfly. The eggs are laid at the base of a spine of blackthorn. And it's most often surveyed by actually looking for the eggs in the winter. It's one of the sort of nerdy things that butterfly enthusiasts do with a magnifying glass, surveying for the distribution of the brown hairstreak. This is a small tortoiseshell. I just put it in to illustrate one of the most magnificent things about butterflies is observing the metamorphosis. So this is the pupa or chrysalis of the small tortoiseshell. And about a day before the adult emerges, the sort of chitin of the chrysalis becomes transparent, and you can see the wing of the butterfly, the eye, the antennae, and then this splits open. The butterfly emerges and usually rests hanging from the chrysalis, dries its wings. At this stage, it's very, very vulnerable. It could be very easily picked off by a predator or a bird or something like that. But it needs to sort of pump lymph from its body through the veins in the wing, and then the wings sort of dry out in the sun before it can take its first flight. So this is a member of the group, the Nymphalidae. You'll all recognise this. This is the peacock. The peacock, along with the small tortoiseshell and the comma, all breed on nettles. So one of the best things you can do if you can put up with it is have a patch of nettles in a sunny spot in your garden. You could even, put them in a pot if you want to constrain the roots and limit its spread. But it's one of the best things you can do to support butterflies is have a patch of nettles in your garden. You could have at least 3 different species breeding on there. Orchards or apples, either in a garden or an orchard, are an extremely good source of sugars in the autumn when windfall apples have fallen to the ground. And peacocks, commas, red admirals in particular will feast on the fermenting sugars of the rotting apples. It's a very good thing to do. Never tidy up your windfalls. Bird species like fieldfare, for example, will also, and blackbirds will love you for it. This is a comma. It's the only butterfly that has this wonderfully sort of crenellated edge to the wing. I said it breeds on nettles, which it does, but it also has some other species which it breeds on. This is wild hop. So if you've got a trailing hop or wild hop in your garden, don't cut it back because the comma will breed on it. And they will also successfully breed on elm if you've got any Wiltshire elm or English elm, for example, in a hedgerow. And the comma is the most wonderfully cryptic on the underwing, as it is camouflaged very much like a dead leaf. It's so called a comma because it has this lovely white mark here. I mentioned earlier that it hibernates in the winter, so you can imagine it tucked up amongst some sort of dead leaves, or in a hedgerow, or in a woodland. The painted lady on the left-hand side here is the other sort of true migrant species, and this has a remarkable journey because it actually starts its journey in North Africa, in the Atlas Mountains in Morocco. And every year, if breeding conditions are right, we will always see some painted ladies in the UK, but they don't occur in great numbers every year. But it heads north and it breeds on different patches of nettles as it heads north, up through Spain, up through France, and then not nettles, thistles, sorry. And then arrives usually in May. In some years, you get a so-called painted lady year, and these can be seen, in their millions. There are stories of literally millions of butterflies seen crossing the English Channel. I had a holiday in northern Spain, maybe about 12 years ago, at the end of May, and we were just in a town, and there were butterflies all day flying through that town. It was quite remarkable, and I just knew that year was going to be a good year in the UK. This is a very fresh one. It has this gloriously salmon pink and orange markings, and the underside is very, very cryptic, and it's particularly well camouflaged if it's at rest on, in this case, on a sort of lichen-covered boulder. The red admiral on the right-hand side also breeds on nettles. It's a reasonably common butterfly, along with the painted lady, peacock, comma, tortoiseshell, and red admiral. These absolutely love things like buddleia in your garden. I expect everyone is aware of Buddleia davidii, the so-called butterfly bush. Just fantastic to have in your garden for a whole variety of species. This is a wonderful butterfly called the white admiral. This is definitely a habitat specialist in that it breeds in mature broadleaf woodland. It has a glorious sort of gliding flight, and it breeds on honeysuckle, but not on honeysuckle which is sort of in flower. It favours just sort of wispy trailing honeysuckle, which is sort of hanging down in sort of dapple shade, and the female lays eggs singly on a leaf of honeysuckle, and the larvae actually hatches and overwinters as a small caterpillar curled up in a small dead honeysuckle leaf, and this flies usually in late June. The nearest place that I know these occur from me in Devizes is Green Lane Wood at Trowbridge. There are, I suspect, reasonable colonies in most good broadleaf woodlands, places like Ravensroost Wood, for example, and Grovely Wood. They occur. It has really lovely markings on the underside, and they very characteristically sort of sit out on a sort of oak leaf and either rest or bask. This is the purple emperor, which really is the emperor of all butterflies. It's not that easy to see because it spends most of its life high in the treetops. And although I've been watching butterflies for almost 50 years, I don't have a great deal of luck with the purple emperor. And this is actually a scan from an old slide that I probably took 30 years ago. And I've been to purple emperor woods many times, hoping to get a repeat, and I still haven't managed it, even though I know where to go. And it's just because the butterflies don't often come down to the ground. Early in the flight period, at usually the end of June, early July, the males will come down to the ground, and they take up minerals and salts from damp ground, which are used in the production of sperm, which are then passed on when mating. You can just about see the sort of purpley colour here. It's the result of the refraction of light. So unless you get the angle of light bouncing off the wings correctly, you will never really see it all purple in one go. But that's the aim, and I'll still keep going. This breeds on sallows, sort of fairly mature sallow bushes in woodland rides and edges. I put this in simply because it's probably my favourite butterfly, but it's a rare migrant. not a regular migrant. It's a rare migrant to the UK. It's a butterfly called the Camberwell Beauty, which also breeds on sallows, but it's a European species really, and we tend to get occasional migrations, usually from Scandinavia, but it has this glorious, I don't know, what sort of mauve, reddy mauve background colour, and the blue spots and this fantastic yellow fringe, and the underside is very, very cryptic with this black underside and white border. And another irregular migrant is the large tortoiseshell, which used to occur, sort of became extinct in the United Kingdom in the 1960s, and probably as a result of Dutch elm disease. It breeds on elms predominantly, but you do get a few seen every year and occasionally in Wiltshire. This is the marsh fritillary, moving in, still in the Nymphalidae, but moving on to a group of butterflies called the fritillaries. The marsh fritillary, Wiltshire is a national stronghold and probably a European stronghold. And I think we're very, very lucky to have it. It's a particularly attractive butterfly. This is a female. You can see the very, very swollen body. It emerges from its chrysalis with a full egg load and is often mated by a male even before its wings have fully dried. Pewsey Downs, I showed this picture at the beginning, but Pewsey Downs is one of the sort of strongholds. And in 2005, it's a butterfly that fluctuates in unison with a parasitic wasp. So when the parasite load is high, you see few butterflies, but when the parasite load is low, you get a lot. And we reckon a conservative estimate of seeing 10,000 marsh fritillary butterflies in 2005 at the end of May. It was quite incredible. You could barely walk through fear of treading on them emerging. It was quite amazing. And this species breeds on one of the scabiouses, the devil's bit scabious. The female lays an egg batch on the underside of a good, strong, healthy leaf of devil's bit scabious in a sward, which is sort of roughly, sort of on average, about 15 centimetres high. It doesn't like the sward being grazed right down flat. It has to be good, strong, healthy plants. The eggs are laid as a batch, and if there isn't a lot of food pile on, then the larvae are going to starve. Has a particularly attractive underside, and this is at rest, in this case, on a delightful little plant called chalk milkwort. This is photographed at a site called Morgan's Hill, which is not far from Devizes. But this butterfly occurs probably more widely than we realise, but on most south-facing cattle-grazed chalk downs, and particularly abundant on Salisbury Plain. This is the dark green fritillary. It's one of the larger of our fritillaries, has these lovely broad orange wings. The males like to bask, particularly early in the morning, absorbing the heat of the sun on bare ground before they fly. This is the round way down above Devizes, which is particularly good for the dark green fritillary. And the dark green fritillary is amongst a group of other fritillary butterflies which all breed on violets, and in this case it breeds on hairy violets, growing in amongst the grassland sward on these sort of chalk downland combes. You can see the action of the grazing animals again. It has a lovely array of silver spots on the underside of the wing, with this sort of olivey green and brown background colour. It's a very strong flyer, and you see the males hawking, you know, quite swiftly, low over the ground, and they will be hunting females, which release a pheromone as soon as they emerge, and males often will seek them out, find them, and mate even before the females manage to dry their wings. So it's tough. It's tough being a female butterfly. The males tend to emerge a bit early and seek you out straight away. This is the largest of our fritillary butterflies. It's the silver washed fritillary. It's a species of mature broadleaf woodland. This is the male, which is orange in colour. If you note this wing vein here, these three wing veins are swollen, and they contain pheromones. And the silver washed fritillary has a particularly delightful mating dance, whereby the female flies along in a straight line along a woodland ride, and the male flies along in circles underneath her, and then backwards over, and then underneath her, then backwards over. And these wing veins burst open, showering her with pheromones, inducing her to descend and mate. And this is a female, and you can see the underside, so-called silver washed, because it has these glorious silver stripes. The female has two colour forms. This is a form called Valazina, which has this sort of olivey brown background, or sort of greeny brown background colour. The females are generally more orange, not as orange as the male that I've just showed you, not as orange as that, but a deeper orange. These are interesting. That the female actually lays her eggs on the northern side of a mossy trunk of an oak tree, usually, where it's cooler and damper. And the first instar larvae hatches. The eggs are laid sort of July, August. The first instar larvae hatches, eats the eggshell, and almost immediately goes into hibernation. And then in the spring, it descends to the woodland floor and seeks out common dog violet, which it feeds on. This is the pearl-bordered fritillary, which is also a violet feeder, but it's now become rather a rare species and only really occurs at 2 or 3 locations in Wiltshire. Bentley Wood in the south of the county, and there's also a colony on Porton Down and a few in Groveley Wood. And then there's another species, which I don't have a picture of, which is called the small pearl-bordered fritillary, which is even rarer and possibly thought to have gone extinct in Wiltshire in the last couple of years, last seen in Bentley Wood. 2 delightful spring fritillaries, which generally see flying in sort of April, May. April if it's warm enough, but May certainly. So that's the nymphalid, and then I'm moving on to a group of species which are all grass feeders in the Satyridae family. Now, although this is a white in the sense that it's called a marbled white, it is in the family amongst the rest of the browns. This is a wonderful sort of checkered chessboard pattern. The upper side, and then on the left-hand side is this butterfly photographed from the underside. These are probably, well, certainly incredibly abundant, particularly on chalk downs, but in some of our hay meadows as well, particularly in the north of the county. The the female is rather indiscriminate in where she lays her eggs. She just flies along and sort of pops her eggs out, dropping them wherever they fall. And then the larvae hatch from the egg, and they will feed on a number of fine-leaved grasses in the early instars and then move on to broad-leaved grasses later on. It's one of my truly sort of favourite butterflies. Very easy to find, particularly early morning before the sun has warmed up. They either bask at the top of flowers, this case devil's whip scabious, but on top of strong grass stems like sort of Bromus erectus, for example. The female, you'll see on the right hand side, there's a mating pair here, has a sort of browny yellow ground colour to the underside, whereas the male is very distinctively black and white. On the right hand side is one of our smaller browns. It's called the small heath, which is very common, particularly on downland, but also in some of our meadow sites. The left here is a pair of meadow browns, which are probably our most abundant butterfly. They can be seen in their thousands, particularly on the downs, but also in meadows, but hedgerows and woodland rides as well, very, very frequent. And on the right hand side is another brown called the ringlet, which has these beautiful golden rings around a black dot with a white centre. Another grass feeder. I've got, I was going to mention it a bit later, but I've got both of these breeding in my garden. One of the best things you can do in your garden is either sow a little mixed grass margin. I've got a margin which is only about 1.5 foot wide on either side of my lawn, goes the length of the garden, and it supports meadow browns breeding ringlets and also the occasional gatekeeper. This is a wall brown on the left hand side, not too dissimilar at first sight from the fritillaries, but rather different in habit. It likes very, very warm situations on downland, often with a lot of bare ground, and the eggs are laid on and the caterpillars feed on very sort of fine-leaved grasses, like some of the fescues or the bents. I've seen a wall brown disappear down a rabbit hole and lay an egg on the root of a grass, which was rather interesting. On the right hand side is the gatekeeper, which is so called because it's very, very commonly seen on sort of field margins, at the base of hedges, gateways, like sort of taller grasses in sort of damper shaded situations. Hopefully the base of the hedge hasn't been sort of sprayed out, but it's quite a common species. You'll notice the gatekeeper has 2 white dots here compared to the wall brown, which has 1 white dot there, and also the meadow brown on the upper, superficially similar, has a black circle but only 1 white dot in the middle. So if you see 2 white dots, it's a gatekeeper. Also, this is a male. I mentioned the sex brand Vane within the silverwash fritillary. This is also a sex brand in the male gatekeeper, and also has sort of pheromones. This is the speckled wood, which I'm sure you will perhaps have seen, particularly on the edge of a shaded woodland. These males occupy little pools of sunlight on the edge of a wood or a ride, and the males are very, very territorial, and they will occupy the sunny patch and they will challenge everything that flies into that sunny patch, whether it's another butterfly species or a bee or anything else. And if another speckled wood male arrives, they will fly off together in a spiraling flight some distance away, and then eventually they will separate, and the male, who is the occupier of the sunny patch, bumbles back to reoccupy the sunny patch. Obviously he's occupying it, waiting for a female to come along. These are two examples of skippers. These are the sort of fastest flying, perhaps harder to sort of determine butterflies. On the left hand side is the small skipper. On the right hand side is the large skipper. On the right hand side there's a male on the right and a female on the left, and the male has this swollen vein again with pheromones. The small skipper is very, very similar to another species called the Essex skipper, and the distinguishing feature is that the underside of the antenna on the small skipper is orange, whereas the underside and the tip of the Essex skipper looks as if it's been dipped in soot and distinctively black. And these occur, or these breed on grasses. This is a skipper. Unlike the large, the small and the Essex skipper, which always hold their forewing at a 45-degree angle to the hind wing, the underwing, the grizzled skipper has its wings spread out flat. It's a lovely little butterfly which breeds on a number of plant species from the Rosaceae family, like wild strawberry, creeping cinquefoil, bramble. And they fly very, very fast, often hard to distinguish. I thought I'd just throw in a few extras, because there are some day-flying moths which can be confused with the skippers when flying. This is a moth, day-flying moth called the mother Shipton, because of this outline here, which is thought to be that of a sort of witch's face, which is rather interesting. This is a downland species called the yellow shell, which also flies in the daytime on chalk downland, feeding on bed straws, usually on downland or on ladies' bed straw. This is one of a group of 3 moths in, they're all called foresters. There's the Sisters forester, the scarce forester, and the forester. Now, this is probably the Sisters forester because it is on downland where a lot of rock rose occurs. They are identified by looking rather closely at the antennae, and I'm afraid I'm not sure exactly which one this is, but I'm guessing, because of the habitat, that it's the Sisters forester, but it's one of the few sort of green moths. Another very characteristic day-flying moth is the 5-spot burnet. There is also a 6-spot burnet moth and also a narrow-bordered 5-spot burnet. So if you see a burnet moth on downland, it could be one of 3, or in a meadow, it could be one of 3 different species of burnet moths, usually, well, all feeding on birdsfoot trefoil. And I threw this in because this is an elephant hawk moth, because you can get these in your garden. Every year at the Wildlife Trust, or when working as an ecologist, I used to get a phone call saying somebody had found a small snake in their garden and what should they do with it. And invariably, well, you knew immediately that they had found the caterpillar of an elephant hawk moth, which has a spine on one end and very, very large eye spots on the forehead, and it does look a little bit intimidating. There's another species slightly smaller called the small elephant hawk moth, which does breed on downland, and it feeds on ladies' bedstraw. And I'm just throwing in a few others because these were all found in my garden. And when I say found, in the sense that I sometimes put a moth trap out, which is a powerful light, just in the garden to see what arrives. And there are 3 different species of hawk moth here. On the left-hand side is a poplar hawk, a female above with a very swollen body, male below with a narrow body, which is sort of upturned. This feeds on poplars. The eyed hawk moth on top right is a species which feeds on sallows, but it will also breed on apple and crabapple. So you could well have this in a garden situation if you've got apples or hedgerow with crab apples. And then bottom right is the privet hawk moth. So if you've got a privet hedge or any privet, you could well have privet hawk moths. These are large things, so they're stunning things to see. They fly at night time. This beautiful thing is one of 2 species. I suspect people will know the hummingbird hawk moth, which is a migrant from Europe and breeds on bedstraws on downland. This is a moth called the broad-bordered beehawk, and it breeds on honeysuckle in broadleaf woodland. There is another species called the narrow-bordered beehawk, which can be seen on downland in its day flying, and it breeds on devil's bit scabious and is a classic bee mimic. These were also in the garden. This is the swallowtail moth, which breeds on ivy, but also on sort of blackthorn and hawthorn. And this is a selection of what people sometimes call little brown jobs, although these are little grey jobs. These all have come, well, these were all in a single moth trap. There's a sort of well-known peppered moth here. If anyone remembers their O-level biology, learning about pollution and the moth Biston betullaria in polluted cities, this moth is of a black form, but in less polluted areas, it is this sort of white speckled, and there's a grey dagger and a dot moth, a marbled miner. I think that's a sycamore. That's a buff ermine. So there's a lot to see if you look. A few pictures just to illustrate sort of meadow habitats. I have this strip of, this isn't my garden, this is Clattinger Farm, part of the Lower Moor Farm Wiltshire Wildlife Trust Nature Reserve in the north of the county. But I do have a strip of fritillaries in amongst the meadow, which I've got along the end of my garden, which is remarkably, they're coming into flower. And within a week, I'll have the first flower, which is very early. It's been such a mild spring. But this is a carder bee, pollination in action. And the fritillaries in particular have a sort of symbiotic relationship with bumblebees. So if you want to support bumblebees in your garden, plant some fritillaries, amongst other things. This is a part of the Clattinger Farm site, really wonderful sward full of devil's bit scabious. There's a bit of great Burnet there, greater knapweed, betony, oxeye daisy, lady's bedstraw. If you haven't been to Clattinger Farm, go in June, they are, I think, rightly claims to be the most species-rich hay meadows in England. And if you're really brave, get up very, very early and you can see the most wonderful early morning light just lighting up the golds and the mauves and the oranges and the whites of the sward. This is a site called Morningside Meadows at Great Wood and Bassett, which the Wildlife Trust purchased maybe 6 years ago. We managed to purchase it just under the noses of it being sold by Wiltshire Council. It had been advertised as suitable for development or improvement, which I couldn't believe. And I went out to the site and I actually phoned the council up from the site and said, you cannot sell that site. It's far too important. And eventually they listened to us. This is Bethany, Ladies' Bedstraw. This site is absolutely bouncing, literally bouncing with marbled whites and meadow browns and skippers in June. And it's the only site that I know with wonderful displays of meadow cranesbill, really quite a wonderful display. This is Cloatley Meadows, which is in the Braden Forest area, and you can. These strips of meadowsweet are in the furrows of the ridge and furrow field system. It's late summer, so it's quite a high sward, so you can't really see, but there's a very distinct ridge and furrow with meadowsweet growing in the damp bits. This is also exceptionally good for marbled whites, meadow browns. This is the most colourful meadow I know, perhaps, called Ecologist Meadows. Really, just extraordinary. And this is the countryside that we have lost. You know, the countryside is not supposed to be green, and we need to get back to at least every community. Just imagine if every community had access to a few fields that were as colourful as that. And this is literally bouncing with butterflies and grasshoppers and bees and hoverflies, you know, with swallows and swifts, you know, zooming across the top. That's another picture of Ecolodge. Now, just briefly, in terms of best locations, Savernake Forest is wonderful. Groveley Wood near Salisbury, Bentley Wood in the south east of the county, Green Lane Wood near Trowbridge, and then Raven's Roost in the north of the county. And then any of the downs really, but I've just listed 5 of the downs: Salisbury Plain, Pusey Downs, Cheryl Downs, Mere Downs, Scratchbury and Cotley Hills near Warminster, and then Morgan's Hill. And hopefully this will work, but if you can see my screen, there we are. Butterfly Conservation Wiltshire have produced a very lovely book, Butterfly Walks in Wiltshire, listing, I think, about 30 different walks with detailed description of how to access and the sorts of species that you might like to see. So that's really, really well worth looking at. And then if you want to understand a little bit more about the state of Britain's butterflies, although Wiltshire is very good for butterflies, it has experienced, you know, very significant declines, just like the rest of the UK. And it's staggering to think that actually overall 76% of UK resident and regular migrants have declined in either abundance or occurrence or both in the past 4 decades. I often rather sadly say, working in nature conservation, you almost feel as if you've been supervising the decline of things, not through lack of any effort or intention, but the pressures on the countryside have been so severe in the last 30 to 40 years that we really are at I think, a tipping point, if not beyond it, with respect to certain species. So those are good sources of information. And then within your garden, if you wanted to have sort of garden plants, things like lavender, hebe, buddleia, echinacea, the sort of cone flowers, red valerian, verbena bonariensis, sedum and hemp agrimony are all wonderful nectar sources. More native wild flowers or plants, very well worth planting. 3 scabious plants there: knapweed and greater knapweed, sainfoin, marjoram, thyme, betony, birdsfoot trefoil, oxeye daisy. And then butterfly conservation have also very helpfully, this is the National Butterfly Conservation website, I've got a gardening for butterflies page, and they have a very good resources section here, listing nectar plants, food plants, monthly gardening blogs. So that's worth looking at. And then food plants for supporting breeding in your garden. So these are the plants that butterflies might lay their eggs on rather than nectar, although some butterflies will also take nectar from these plants. But they're obviously going to be good for other things as well. So nettles, hedge garlic, cougar flower, holly, ivy, dogwood, Persian buckthorn, birdsfoot trefoil, nasturtiums. If you want to stop some of the white butterflies eating your cabbages, plant nasturtiums, and then they'll eat that instead. Common sorrel, and there's a range of grasses, which in particular things like the meadow brown, gatekeeper, some of the skippers will also breed on. And just to mention, whoops, at the very end, I've talked about sort of chalk grass, and there's a range of habitat specialists. So some of the blues, unimproved meadows, very, very good for butterflies, broadleaf woodland, and then the wider countryside. But there are threats to all of these. The occurrence of the habitat is very much dictated by geology and the habitats that they support. Threats which have certainly been prevalent in the last 40 years and in some respects are ongoing: habitat fragmentation. So breeding sites have become too distant from each other to cope with local extinctions, and butterflies are not able to sort of migrate because some butterflies really don't fly very far. Changes in land management, agricultural improvement, sadly herbicides and pesticide use still, development, and increasingly potentially climate change. Things that would support them in the wider countryside, we must install more sort of habitat corridors, particularly nectar-rich corridors, so butterflies are able to transit between good habitat patches, but having nectar along the way. Good sensitive hedgerow management, particularly for species like the brown hairstreak, which if it was flailed every year would have all the eggs stripped out. And then flower-rich field margins, very important. And then in terms of in your garden, any of these actions, not mowing your lawn to within an inch of its life, or leaving a strip unmown perhaps, have a word with Paul, plant a garden meadow, install nectar sources, but also breeding sites within your garden, and also shelter for hibernation in the winter. Thank you very much. That's me done. Any questions?
Can you tell me, Stephen, it's a really ignorant question, but how long does a butterfly live? I know you said at the beginning there are some that overwinter.
Well, it varies between about sort of 5 days and 10 months, depending on who you are. If you're a brimstone, you emerge as an adult in August, and you sort of feed up on nectar for maybe 6 weeks, then you go into hibernation, and you survive the whole winter. And as soon as it warms up probably in March, you emerge, take nectar from the first spring flowers, find a mate, and then probably live for another month, and then you eventually die. But if you're a blue, for example, some of the blue butterflies only live about 5 days, and then that's it.
Yes, that's why. I mean, that's why it's inspired. Butterflies have inspired so much poetry.
Yes.
You know, that ephemeral nature of, you know, the beauty that's so transient.
And some butterflies overwinter as an egg, some overwinter as a larva, a caterpillar, some as a chrysalis or pupa, and then some as an adult. So it varies very much depending on who you are.
Yes, gosh, yes. Extraordinary. And well, I'm certainly going to try and go to a few of these places where, so, you know, the meadows that you mentioned, like it was Pewsey Down is that
Pewsey Downs is downland. It's national
downland, yeah. So that's open and you can just walk around.
Oh, yeah.
And we'll come across butterflies. Do you think? I mean, or are they disturbed? It must be disturbed.
Late May, June. The last week in May and the first 2 or 3 weeks in June are probably best. And then in butterfly parlance, there's something called the June gap, when the first broods have flown, and there's a bit of a gap before the second broods emerge.
Get this off now. There's quite a lot of questions coming up here.
Yes, there's one in the chat here for you. Sarah sweetly saying, another ignorant question. It seems the top of the butterfly is the more colourful. Is that for mating? Except for the white admiral, whose underside seemed more colourful.
I am now
Stephen.
I think that's true. I think the underside is when the butterfly is at rest, hiding. It wants to be secure. It doesn't want to be detected. So it's often very sort of cryptic camouflage. So it does help it not being found by a bird, principally.
Okay, and Marie, well, actually, Marie is saying this to everyone. What kind of wintering shelter can we provide in a private garden? Are butterfly boxes a word idea? I.e., are they just decoration?
I don't think I've heard of bat boxes and bird boxes. Not particularly butterfly boxes. If you've got a shed, you know, a cool shed or a cool garage, they'll find their way in through a window. I often have tortoiseshells and peacocks in our garage, which is well, it's got plenty of holes in which they can get in. Ivy on a tree is extremely good for things like brimstones and commas.
Several people saying wonderful photos again, Stephen, just so you know.
Thank you.
I think everyone was really amazed. Liz just said, Liz Booty said, I saw 2 yellow brimstones today.
Good. Yeah, I had my first one in my garden today, first brimstone.
We've got 11 questions in the chat room.
Well, I've just done the last one. I think I've done all of them except for this last one. What lens do you use for your photos?
I've got a 100mm macro lens, if people understand what that means, which gives 1-to-1 reproduction. So if a subject like a butterfly is an inch across, it will appear an inch across on the sensor. That's 1-to-1 reproduction. Occasionally, for the smaller butterflies, I'll use an extension tube which goes between the lens and the camera, and that gives you an even bigger magnification for things like the skippers and the small blue and 1 or 2 of the others.
You must be very, very patient.
I've spent over 50 years honing my practice.
Yeah. Well, it's so much better than trapping them.
Yeah, you need to. Well, it's getting to know and understand the habitat and the ecology, and also the weather. John
Treble asks how close you are when you take the photo, Stephen.
You're pretty close with a macro lens. You're I don't know, depending on the species, between 6 and 10 inches.
Yes.
You can use longer zoom lenses, but they tend to be rather heavy to manipulate.
Oh.
And if you go out, the thing to do is if you understand the habitat and you know the species are going to be there, go out early morning when you're more likely to find them roosting in the cool morning on a grass stem or a flower, and then you can actually approach quite closely. And I often use a tripod as well.
Yes.
To mount the camera on with a cable release.
Mm-hmm.
It's harder if it's very hot and bright and sunny. They're just so active that you won't get near them.
Oh, there's a sweet message saying, thank you from Yorkshire. As an ex-Wiltshire boy, I'm longing to come back soon now. That's from Yorkshire Branch Butterfly.
Oh, right, good.
Oh, it's good to know there's other sites. Oh, well, we don't seem to have got anywhere, I don't think, with seeing people, any more people.
Sorry, I'm really sorry, Anthony. I've tried my best. I just can't.
No, don't worry. Maybe people have to do it to themselves. But well, I can't see any more questions. And what do you think? Should we wind up then, if everybody's?
Yeah. I was going to say, Anthony, what I'll do is I'll try and get all those lists that Stephen has printed out and put on his slides of habitat and fields, meadows, where to go. And I'll get them out to everybody on the Nature Chain email.
Yes, that would be lovely. And I love the idea of, because obviously, as you know, Stephen, the whole idea of Nature Chain is creating these corridors for nature, but the idea of making them with nectar, would you actually say nectar for butterflies?
Oh, definitely. They're absolutely fueled by nectar. If they don't get any nectar, they'll just expire.
So the corridors will be nectar filled. That's what we need to do.
But plant grass species as well, because it's important to have breeding sites for the grass species. And some of the nectar plants are also things like bird's-foot trefoil, the common blue will breed on. So there are benefits, and there'll be a range of moths which occur on the flower species as well.
Lovely. Well, and we're so lucky having Paul and Lulu on our team, who are busily going around the neighbourhood planting all sorts of things, which in the next few years we're going to be very butterfly filled, I expect, with any luck. And hopefully Nature Chain spreading. So, you know, it's all so good to hear. I mean,
and Anthony, we've got some really good talks coming up as well, haven't we?
Yes. But anyway, for now, shall we?
Yes.
Thank you, Stephen.
Yes. Thank you, Stephen, on behalf of everyone tonight who's watched and on the whole of Nature Chain. It was really interesting.
Really beautiful.
And loved it. Thank you so much.
Good luck. Good luck. The butterflies.
Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.